So I'm going to talk to you about two projects that I've been working on, looking at researching and having that research really inform restoration in meadows in the Sierra Nevada that have legacy grazing impacts. And for this project, I worked with Dr. David Cooper at Colorado State University and Athena Demetri, Sue Beatty, and Joel Wagner with the National Park Service. And the unifying theme that I'm really going to be coming back to for when talking about both of these meadows is the soil, water, plant feedback. So these three ecosystem processes that really form and maintain meadows. I'll show some evidence of the long-term stability of these processes through millennia and how intense grazing was really a novel impact that decoupled these processes and broke this feedback and caused a threshold crossing impact. And how that impact really manifests differently in sloping versus flat wetlands. So each of the examples I'm going to give represents a sloping wetland and a flat wetland. And the methods of restoring these processes really differ given the different responses in sloping and flat wetlands. So the first site I'll talk to you about is Halstead Meadow in Sequoia National Park, and the meadow surface here is a fairly steeply sloping 5 to 10%. And the park came to Colorado State and asked us whether or not this channel that flows through the meadow is natural, is stable, is it in need of restoration. They were concerned about these unstable cut banks, this exposure of sediment, and really wanted kind of a basic research project. So I'm not going to get into all the data that we collected. We put out a lot of groundwater monitoring wells, collected vegetation data. What I will focus on is the soil stratigraphy that is exposed in these gullies. And this is a stratigraphic section of meadow from a really, really great dissertation from 1975 by Spencer Hoffman Wood. He looked at 10 or more meadows, found that really this sequence is repeated throughout Sierra Meadows, where you have gully exposing 10 to 15 or 20 feet of accumulated fine-grained sediment over 10,000 years. So he did carbon dates and showed that even during periods of time, great climate shifts where pine trees were established within these meadows, so dry periods, all the way through alternating periods of peat accumulation, storm deposits of sands and gravels. This was an accretionary history. There's no evidence through any of these stratigraphic sections, and this includes what we see at Halstead Meadow, of any large-scale erosion. The 10-foot, 20-foot deep gullies leave their mark in the stratigraphic record, and there really is no evidence of that. So looking at just the physical processes of soil and water here, in order to have a domain of deposition in a mountain landscape, you really don't expect that to occur much because you need a low slope and low flow energy essentially to expect sediment to be deposited. And it's not until you really consider the addition of wetland plants to the equation that you can really explain the occurrence of a lot of meadows in the Sierra Nevada. Wetland plants form dense root and rhizome networks that knit together and form an impenetrable sod and really hold soil in place, resist flow. And once these plants get removed, it then re-exposes all of this fine-grained sediment to erosion again. So you've re-entered that erosional domain. And the triggering event for vegetation removal was the intense period of unregulated grazing in the late 1800s, where for every summer, all summer, for decades long, millions of sheep initially, and then cattle as well. This is from down south in Sequoia Kings Canyon all the way through World War II and beyond. Really removed, denuded the vegetation and also trampled the soil. And really that forms the kind of the historical backdrop of how these novel incision events started and how they're removing significant portions of this 10,000 year accreted sedimentary history. And so you can see, I'll just really briefly show you on this picture, the hydrologic impacts are evident to the eye. All of the area next to the gully is dried out. These are totally different plant species here. These are not wetland plants. This area back here, farther from the gully, has a dense root and rhizome network of sedges. So this area is very resistant to erosion. This is all completely vulnerable. So this is a very unstable system. And so, our conclusion was restoration is necessary. This is what the gully looked like in 2006. It was a pretty straightforward restoration. We filled the gully in with a lot of dirt. We brought the topography back up to the level of the meadow surface. That eliminated the hydrologic drain that the gully was causing, so it brought the water table back up to the surface, spread flow out across the entire site. That created wetland conditions where we could then get these wetland plants reestablished. And it's been, 4 years since this photograph, but more like 7 years since the restoration was completed. So we're really hopeful that these plants have had enough time to grow, knit together that below ground support structure for the soil that they can withstand whatever Godzilla El Nino throws at them. But we'll see. So again, Halstead Meadow sits somewhere in this domain where once it loses its plants, it erodes, but we really think we've reestablished the stable condition with the plant soil water feedback. So that's the sloping meadow example I wanted to talk about. The next project that I've been working on is in Tuolumne Meadows. It's a very flat meadow. And I'm going to mostly outline sort of our research there, and we're just embarking on a restoration. I'll just touch on that really briefly at the end. But these photographs I showed earlier, this is Tuolumne Meadows from around 1890. So this was sort of ground zero for a lot of the sheep impact. So we know that the grazing was significant and intense in Tuolumne Meadows. But there's no erosion gully. There's no smoking gun of a large, unstable landscape feature out in Tuolumne Meadows. But what is evident, and what the park saw in 2008 when they did a vegetation study out there, was that the vegetation in Tuolumne is different than in a lot of nearby meadows. So this is a slightly busy graph, I apologize. This is Tuolumne Meadows vegetation dominance by forbs. Forbs are non-grass-like plants. So the wetland plants I was talking about, sedges, are graminoids, grass-like. So this Tuolumne Meadows is dominated by mostly non-grass-like plants as compared to nearby meadows, with one exception. And then it's also got a lot more bare ground. This is percent bare ground. Again, as compared to nearby meadows, with one exception that receives a lot of pack stock impact. So when looking out at the vegetation in Tuolumne Meadows, we generally see sparse annuals and taprooted perennials. But interestingly, when we take soil samples in Tuolumne Meadows, we see high soil organic content. And this forms a disconnect in our conceptual model of taprooted perennials and annuals really have low below-ground productivity, and we wouldn't expect them to form high organic soils. So soil takes hundreds, maybe thousands of years to form. So we see this high soil organic content, and we think, well, this soil was formed by dense perennial clonal sedges. And those plants are out there in the meadow, but in very small numbers. And so what we think happened is that intense grazing really destroyed that plant community, and that what's out there right now is the result of that intense grazing impact. And the main question really that our research focused on is, why hasn't this plant community transitioned back to the dense perennial clonal sedges if we still have the high soil organic content, which has a high water holding capacity, the sponge that people have referred to in the past? Well, we think that, and our hypothesis is that current herbivory by ground squirrels and deer, native herbivores, is suppressing any recovery of these clonal sedges. They're slow-growing plants. They don't produce a lot of seed. They're largely clonal reproducers. And so if there's only a few individuals left out in Tuolumne Meadows, we just think they're not able to recolonize due to native herbivory. So we conducted an experiment. We excluded herbivores from treatment plots. We planted a couple of these species out into those plots to see if they're really targets of herbivory. And then critically, we measured carbon flux. So we measured the amount of carbon dioxide that's being added to the ecosystem through photosynthesis, and then the amount of carbon dioxide that's being given off to the atmosphere through soil decomposition, microbial respiration, plant respiration, with the goal of really measuring whether or not the plant community that's there now is maintaining the soil, or if the soil is decomposing faster than the plant community is keeping up with. And so that's what these preliminary data are really showing. It's a complicated graph. I'll simplify it. This is gas flux. You can think of the dotted line as the ground surface. And any values above the dotted line is CO2 being lost to the atmosphere. Anything below the dotted line is CO2 entering the plant soil ecosystem. So photosynthesis is a process that takes CO2 and adds it to the system. Respiration is the process that microbes and plants are respiring CO2 out into the atmosphere, and the black dots are simply the sum of those two processes, the net CO2 flux. So in the control plots where there's still native herbivory, we see a net loss of CO2 to the atmosphere. When we fence those plots, there's still a net loss, but it's less. And then in reference sites, so in those surrounding meadows that have more of the intact plant community that includes clonal sedges, we see basically parity, where the plant community is really maintaining the soil organic levels, and there's not a net loss of soil organic matter. And then as far as our plantings go, so the plants that we put out into these plots, the sedges, the clonal sedges that we think were a more prevalent part of the plant community, they indeed survived at a greater rate in the fences as compared to the controls. So this is good evidence that they are in fact targets of herbivory. And all of this matters because, these data here are from my colleagues at University of Wisconsin-Madison. They're looking at the percent organic matter in the soil and how it affects plant available water. So basically the sponge effect. And what they're seeing is that as you lose organic matter in the soil, you lose plant available water, but it's not a linear response. And when you start losing organic matter at the low end, you start losing a lot more plant available water. And that's important because a lot of the soils in Tuolumne Meadows, a lot of the samples that we've taken hover right around the 8% or less range. And so a lot of these sites, a lot of the meadow in Tuolumne is really poised to lose a lot of its sponge capacity, a lot of its plant available water if these soils continue to degrade. So I'm going to wrap up, just quickly start at the bottom here actually. So in Tuolumne Meadows, what we're proposing next is to establish large patches of these clonal sedges because we think the problem is they're sparse, they're dispersed, they're easily suppressed by herbivory. So we think if we can get an acre, a few acres of these sedges established out there, and then let the herbivores at them, that those larger patches are going to be more resilient to herbivory and may then be able to spread and recolonize. So we think that those large patches are going to slow down the burrowing rodents, that if we can get that dense root and rhizome network established, that they'll become impenetrable. And it's the plants that make the meadow. They prevent erosion in sloping wetlands. They build that soil organic content through below ground productivity. And the wetland plants need that high soil moisture, so they're a part of that plant soil water feedback. They produce high organic content that adds to the sponge layer. They stabilize soil and prevent down cutting that would lower the water table. So it's all part of the feedback of stability that's been present for 10 millennia out in these Sierra Nevada wetlands. And with that, some pretty pictures and coffee time. Thanks.